In this chapter, we're going to be working with something called shape tweens. Tween is one of the key words that you need to know when you're working in Flash. The word tween is short for in between. In a tween, Flash creates frames of animation for you, so you don't have to create every single frame like you do in a frame-by-frame animation. This is useful because it takes less time, and it's easier to edit than a frame-by-frame animation. So we'll start learning about tweens by talking about tweening shapes. And before you learn how to do shape tweens, I just want to show you the new types of frames that you'll see when you're working with shape tweens. If you look in the timeline in my file here, you'll see green backgrounds. Green backgrounds indicate shape tweens. A shape tween is basically a morph animation using a shape. Basically, you specify a start and an end keyframe, and Flash creates the frames in between, hence the name tween. So if I scrub the playhead, you can see the girl's hair morphs. If I select the hair on the first frame, you'll see that it's a simple shape. So I specified the first and last keyframe, and Flash does everything in the middle. When you see the green in the background, the arrow is indicating a successful shape tween. That means you followed all the rules of creating a tween. I'll explain the rules in more detail later on. An unsuccessful shape tween is represented by a dashed line with a green background. So you can see here, there's something wrong, so the tween is not working properly. If I show that layer and scrub the playhead, you can see the tween stops at frame 11 and does not change for the rest of the time. Now let's talk about the rules of a shape tween. I mentioned earlier that you have to define the start and end keyframes. That's really all you have to do. You just have to make sure that on the start and end keyframes, you only have one shape and no other content. So if you look at my file here, if I click on the first keyframe of the ponytail bottom layer, you can see that all there is on that frame is one simple shape. And if I go to the next keyframe in that layer, you'll see that there's also just one shape. So by following the rule of having one shape on each keyframe, you can create shape tweens. So throughout this chapter, you'll get practice creating your own shape tweens, and you'll learn how to customize them and use them in your applications. To create a shape tween, you'll need to start with keyframes with shapes on them. Remember, shapes only. No groups, no symbols, only basic shapes. Of course, this does include drawing objects, so Flash is not going to discriminate if you use a drawing object instead of a shape. So I have my basic shape on the ponytail bottom layer, and I have my keyframes set up for how I want the ponytail to appear. To create the shape tween, I'm going to right-click in between the two keyframes, and I'm going to choose Create Shape Tween. Once I do that, Flash automatically creates the frames in between. So I'll create two more shape tweens, one between frames 6 and 11, and then one between frames 11 and 16. And there is my shape tween animation. So just remember, you need to have a basic shape in a keyframe. You need to define a start keyframe and an end keyframe. You right-click in between the keyframes, and then you can create the shape tween. And if you want to remove a tween that you've created, you can right-click in between the two keyframes that you have the tween on, and then choose Remove Tween. Sometimes when you create a shape tween in Flash, Flash doesn't create it exactly how you want. I'm going to zoom in on the girl's hair. So I have the ponytail bottom layer, and you can see it animates pretty well. But when I unlock the ponytail top layer, the animation doesn't quite look right. So using shape hints, you can actually fine-tune a shape tween to make it work how you want. Let's go to the first frame and add some shape hints. What you do with shape hints is you connect a point in the starting keyframe of a shape to a point in the ending keyframe of the shape. For example, let's say we wanted to make the top left of the ponytail on this layer correspond to the top left of the ponytail in frame 6. So to do that, I'm going to zoom in, and then I'm going to select the shape, and I'm going to choose Modify, Shape, Add Shape Hint. So then you can see shape, hint, A. There's a lowercase a there. And if I click and drag it, it'll snap onto the edge of the hair. Now, if it's not snapping, you should make sure that you have Snap to Objects turned on in the toolbar. That's the little magnet icon. So I'm going to go to frame 6 now, and you can see the shape hint A in the middle of the screen. I'll click and drag that to that same part that it was on for the first frame. Notice that it turns green. And then when I go back to the first frame, the shape hint is yellow. That shows me that Flash has successfully set up the shape tween and it understands which points are connected. The next step is to connect more points with using shape hints so the animation is more fluid. See, it still looks a little bit weird. So let's go to the first frame and we'll repeat this whole process. Modify, shape, add shape hint. So I'll move shape hint B to here. I'll go to frame 6 and move shape hint B to the same point. Now when I scrub from frame 1 to 6, you can see the animation is a little bit more clean. You can add more shape hints if you'd like to refine the animation further, but for now, that's good for me. So with shape hints, you have control over shape tweens so you can fine-tune them to suit your needs. Sometimes you'll create a tween in Flash and it just won't work. Remember that you can identify a broken tween in the timeline by a dashed line with a green background. See that I have a broken tween between frame 11 and 16. Let's try to find out what's wrong. I'm going to click on frame 11 to select all the artwork on that layer. I can see that all that's selected is the shape in the girl's hair. If I select it, I can see that it's a shape in the Properties panel. Let's go to the last keyframe and see if everything is right there. I'll click on the last keyframe and I can see that the girl's hair is selected. If I click on the girl's hair, I can see that it's a group. Remember, groups cannot shape tween. So I'm going to have to break this object down to a shape. So here I'm going to use the break apart command, which is Command or Control B. When I do that, I can see that this object is a shape. Now the tween still looks broken in the timeline, but if I click on it, you'll see that it turns into an arrow. And now the tween works properly. So when you have a problem with your shape tween, just go back to the basics. Check all the artwork on the first and last frames of the tween and make sure that you only have shapes. Any groups or symbols will break your shape tween. Motion tweens are the most common form of animation in Flash. In this chapter, we're going to look at how to create motion tweens and how to add them to your applications. On the stage here, I have a motion tween. You can tell a motion tween because of the layer icon. A layer that has a motion tween has a special motion tween icon. You can also recognize a motion tween because of the blue background. Remember, shape tweens have a green background, motion tweens have a blue background. So with a motion tween, you have a keyframe, and then at some point, you'll see a diamond. Those diamond frames are called property keyframes. Unlike a shape tween, where you define a start and an end keyframe, with motion tweens, you just use one object and you create the tween. With a motion tween, instead of using a shape, you use a symbol. So on the stage here, I have an instance of a symbol called biker that's a graphic symbol. If I scrub the playhead, you can see the biker animation moving across the stage. So the main thing I want you to take away from this movie is that motion tweens are animated using symbols and are distinguishable by the blue background in the timeline, a special layer icon, and diamond-shaped property keyframes. Motion tweens are actually the easiest type of tween to create in Flash. Just remember, the most important thing is that you start out with a symbol. So on the stage here, I have a graphic symbol. Also, make sure that symbol is on its own layer and not with any other artwork in another layer. So I have the biker isolated on one layer, and if you select it, you'll see in the Properties panel that it's an instance of a symbol called biker. If I double-click the biker instance on the stage, I can enter symbol editing mode, and you can see that I have an animation inside of here, and the biker is pedaling. So just note that you can even use a motion tween on a symbol that contains an animation. So let's apply the motion tween on the main timeline. And remember, you can return to the main timeline by clicking Scene 1 at the top left of the stage. To apply the motion tween, I can do this either on the object I want to tween or in the timeline. In the timeline, you can just right-click a frame where you have a symbol and choose Create Motion Tween. Or you can right-click an instance on the stage and choose Create Motion Tween. Flash automatically creates a tween that lasts 1 second according to your frame rate. So right now my frame rate is 30 frames per second, so Flash creates a 30-frame animation. Note that the timeline of the background is not extended, so I'll do that right now. Click on frame 30 and press F5. Now I'm actually going to extend this timeline to frame 120. So I'll click the biker layer at frame 120, press F5, and then do the same thing for the background layer. Now I'll go to frame 60 by clicking the 60 number. I'm not going to click on any particular layer here. I'm clicking the frame number so the playhead moves to that point. And then I'm just going to move the biker animation wherever I want, and Flash will create that motion tween. So I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to hold the Shift key so that Flash will constrain the position of the instance horizontally as I drag. That way I can drag the instance in a straight line. Flash then creates that property keyframe on frame 60, and I now have a working motion tween. So let's preview this movie in the Flash player to see what it looks like. Remember, the keyboard shortcut is Command-Return or Control-Enter on the PC. And there's the motion tween in the Flash player. Once you've created a property keyframe for a motion tween, you're not stuck with it there permanently. You can actually edit or change those property keyframes. For example, I have a property keyframe at frame 80 in my animation. Let's say I wanted the animation to take a little bit more time and have the girl move a little bit more slowly on her bike. So to do that, I want to take this property keyframe and move it to frame 120. So the first thing to do is deselect all the frames. So I'm going to click in that gray area at the bottom of the timeline, and then what I'm going to do is right-click that property keyframe. After I've done that, I'll choose Clear Keyframe, and then choose All. Note all the different types of property keyframes: position, scale, skew, rotation, color, and filter. These are all the different properties that you can animate using a motion tween. Basically, you can animate anything in a motion tween that you can animate on an instance. So anything that's applicable to the instance and not the symbol level can be edited and animated in a motion tween. So I'm going to choose to clear all keyframes. And you can see the property keyframe disappears, but I still have the motion tween. So let's go to frame 120, and I'll right-click there, and I'll go to Insert Keyframe, and then I can choose which type of keyframe I want to insert. I'm actually just going to choose All. The property keyframe is inserted, and then I can move the biker wherever I'd like. Also remember, you don't have to choose to insert a property keyframe. You can actually just move the playhead to that point and manipulate your instance as you would like, and Flash will automatically create that property keyframe. So it's really your call how you create a motion tween. But if I test this movie in the Flash player, you can see that the pace is slowed down, and that I've successfully adjusted the property keyframes. One of the types of animations that's really easy to create with a motion tween is parallax scrolling. Using parallax scrolling, you can move different layers of animation to create a 3D effect. Let's take a look at how to do that. On the stage, I'm going to lock every layer except for the Hills front layer. I'm going to animate this layer first. To create the motion tween, I'm going to right-click one of the frames in the Hills front layer in the timeline and choose Create Motion Tween. If you already have the timeline extended, Flash will create a motion tween spanning the entire duration of your timeline. So I'm going to move the playhead to the last frame, and then move the hills to the right. I'm going to hold the Shift key so that the hills don't move up or down as I'm moving them. Now I can preview this animation and see the hills moving. Now I'll lock that layer and unlock hills back. For the back hills, I'm going to move them as well, but I'm going to move them slightly less than the front hills. And this is part of creating that 3D feel. So I'll create the motion tween, go to the last frame, and move the hills to the right. Once I release my mouse button, you can see the distance that the hills move by the motion path on the screen. The motion path is the same color as the outline for your layer. So this purple line shows me how much those back hills are moving. If I select the hill's front layer and pan to the left, I can see how much that layer is moving. So the back layer is moving a little bit less than the front layer. I want to preview this in the Flash player to make sure it looks right. So let's test the movie. Command Return or Control Enter. And it looks like I can move the front hills a little bit more. So I'll go to the last frame and select the front hills and move them a little bit more. We'll test it again. Now there's a little bit more obvious of a difference between the front hills and the back hills. Now I'll move the buildings. So I'll lock the front hills and unlock the skyline layer. I'll create the motion tween in the timeline, go to the last frame, and move the skyline to the right. I don't want to move it that much, just a little bit. And then I'll test the movie and preview my parallax scrolling effect. So parallax scrolling is just one of the neat effects you can create using motion tweens in Flash. Let's say you created a motion tween that you wanted to nest inside of a graphic symbol. In order to do that, you'll need to know how to select and move and copy a motion tween. Fortunately, selecting and moving and copying motion tweens is actually pretty easy. You can select a motion tween by simply clicking on it in the timeline. Once you click on it, you select the whole motion tween span. You can then click and drag to move it around. This is pretty intuitive for working with a motion tween. Of course, if you wanted to copy the motion tween, you can hold the Alt or Option key as you drag it, and you can copy that tween, say, to another layer. I'm actually going to delete those last keyframes by selecting them and pressing Shift F5 on the keyboard. So let's take this motion tween of the sun and put it inside of its own graphic symbol. So what I'm going to do is select the span of frames by single-clicking it. I'm going to right-click, going to choose Cut Frames. You'll then see a blank keyframe on the sun layer. Then I'll go to Insert New Symbol, call this Sun Animation. Then I'll paste the frames by right-clicking the first frame of layer 1 and choosing Paste Frames. And there's the sun animation. Now I'll return to Scene 1, select the sun layer, and on the sun layer, I'll go to the library and click and drag the sun animation onto that layer. I can then move it wherever I'd like to easily place that animation wherever I want with the rest of the artwork on the stage. So now I have that animation nested inside of a graphic symbol. And remember, when you place an animation inside of a graphic symbol, you're going to need to place enough frames on the timeline to accommodate that animation. So I have the same amount of frames as I had before on the main timeline, so there are enough to accommodate that animation. But if I had less frames on the main timeline, then the animation would be cut short. When you create a motion tween that moves an object, Flash automatically creates something called a motion path that matches the outline color set for your particular layer. So if I move the playhead to a later frame, anything after frame 1, and I click on the motion tween, you can see the motion path as a green outline. Notice that green color is the same as the outline color for the biker layer. This path can actually be modified like a regular line drawn with a line tool. For example, I can use the subselection tool and click at the end point of the animation, click and drag up to move the motion path. So I'm moving that anchor point so the girl on the bike will ride up the hill. Now if I preview the animation, you can see her move upward. You can also use the selection tool to modify the path just like you would modify a line. So if you hover over it, you'll see the cursor update to show a curved line, which means you can click and drag up or down to create an arc in your animation. Further, you can click on the path with the selection tool, which will select the whole path, and then you can move the whole path up or down. So we can edit this entire span of frames or this entire animation just by clicking on that motion path and moving it around with the selection tool. So when you create motion tweens, remember that your motion path is not stuck in a straight line. In this movie, we'll look at how to animate rotation using a motion tween. So on the stage here, I have an animation of a girl riding up a hill on a bike. Now you'll notice that she doesn't rotate along with the path. She just moves straight up. So that creates a little bit of an awkward motion, and her bike wheels don't perfectly match up with the trail. So what we'll do is look at using rotation and fine-tuning motion tweens in order to make the animation look more realistic. The first thing I want to do is to move the path to be aligned with the wheels of the bike. So to do that, I'm going to use the free transform tool. So I'll select the biker with the free transform tool and then click and drag to move the transformation point, again that's the circle in the center, down to the bottom. So I want it to match the wheels on the bike. That way it's easier to align the motion path with the trail. If you want to have Flash automatically align the rotation of an instance with its motion path, you can actually select the motion tween in the timeline and then check the Orient to Path option in the Properties panel. That's in the Rotation section. You can also make objects spin by adding to the Rotate 0 times number. So you can click and drag that to make this biker do a flip, for example, if you wanted to. Once you do that, you can control whether the direction is clockwise or counterclockwise. If I check Orient to Path and preview the animation, you'll see this feature doesn't exactly do what I'm looking for. But for sometimes, you may find that it works just right. So I'm actually going to uncheck Orient to Path for now, and I'm going to manually set up a few keyframes, and then I'll fine-tune the animation by editing the motion path. So what I'm going to do is put the playhead in between the first keyframe and then the property keyframe at frame 80. So I'll go to frame 40, and then I'm going to move the biker on the stage to align with the path. So I'll move her up, and then rotate a little bit. I'm going to use the arrow keys on my keyboard to fine-tune the positioning here. So now when I preview the animation, it looks a little bit better for the first part. Once you add more property keyframes to your motion tween, you can actually go in with the selection tool or the sub-selection tool to modify the path further. So for example, I can go to the selection tool and click and drag the motion path to get a little bit more control than I had before. This is because this motion path now has multiple anchor points inside of it. So I'll go down with the sub-selection tool, and I can modify the Bezier curves of these anchor points. I can also delete them. So I'm going to modify them so they are just how I want for this particular animation. I'm going to make sure that they are all aligned with the center of the trail. So once everything's set up there, I'll scrub the playhead to preview the animation. And on the last frame, I can see that there's a little bit of the tire coming off. So I'm going to select the biker there and move her out a little bit, just to make sure that the wheel is off the stage. I'll scrub the playhead one more time to make sure it looks right. And then I'll add a little bit more rotation to her at the end so that she kind of straightens out. It's starting to look pretty good. So let's preview the animation in the Flash player and see what it looks like. So just remember that when you create a motion tween, you're not limited to the original animation that you create. By making those adjustments, you can fine-tune your motion tweens to fit your applications perfectly. When you create motion tweens, remember that you're not limited to movement. You can also animate anything you can modify at the instance level. That includes color transformations that you set in the Properties panel. Remember that instances can't be changed using the Color panel. That's reserved for shapes. To change the color of an instance, you select the instance on the stage and modify its color in the Color Effect area of the Properties panel. So let's modify this animation so the sun fades in. So on the stage I have the sun graphic symbol. I'll right-click it and choose Create Motion Tween to create the animation. Now I want it to start out, faded out, and end up faded in. So I'll go to frame 50, and I'm going to right-click there in the sun layer, and I'm going to choose Insert Keyframe, All. So here I have a property keyframe. Now I'll select the sun on frame 50, go to the Color Effects section of the Properties panel, choose Alpha for the color effect, drag the slider to 100. Once that's set, I'll go back to frame 1, select the sun, drag that alpha slider in the Properties panel down to 0. If I scrub the playhead, I'll see the sun fading in. Let's preview the animation in the Flash player. Command Return on the Mac, Control Enter on the PC. And there's the sun fading in. So using a motion tween, you can animate color changes like alpha transformations using the Properties panel. All you have to do is create the motion tween and add some property keyframes, select the object on those keyframes, and modify the settings in the color effect area in the Properties panel. When you're working with motion tweens, understand that Flash is not really limited to what object can be motion tweened. Remember that in order to motion tween, you need to use a symbol. Now, any object in Flash can be turned into a symbol. So if you want to animate a text field or a bitmap image or any other object in Flash, you just have to get it inside of a symbol. So here I'm going to animate some text. That text is in the logo that says Explore California. I'll start by wrapping this inside of a graphic symbol. To do that, I'm going to lock every layer except for the logo layer. Going to Alt or Option click the dot on the logo layer under the lock. So I've locked everything except for that layer, and now I can click and drag around the logo and press F8 on the keyboard to convert it to a symbol. I'll just call this logo, and then I'll click OK. So now I have an instance of my graphic symbol. Now it's time to create the motion tween. I'll right-click the logo and choose Create Motion Tween. Once I have the motion tween, I'm going to add a property keyframe at frame 60. So I'm going to deselect all the frames in the timeline by clicking below them, and then I'm going to right-click at frame 60 in the logo layer, and then I'll choose Insert Keyframe, All. So now Flash has saved the position of the logo on frame 60. Now I can go to frame 1 and move the logo to the left to create the animation. So while I'm at frame 1, I'll click and drag the logo to the left all the way off the stage, and then you can see the motion path created, indicating that my animation was a success. Let's take a look at this animation inside of the Flash player. Command Return on the Mac, Control Enter on the PC. You can see the logo sliding in. Let's look at how to animate a 3D object in Flash. Remember that if you want to rotate or move an object in 3D space, it needs to be a movie clip symbol, not a graphic symbol. And remember that you can create a movie clip symbol in the same way as a graphic symbol. Select your artwork on the stage, modify Convert to Symbol, and then choose movie clip for the type instead of graphic. So here on the stage, I actually already have an instance of a movie clip symbol, and I'm going to rotate this bridge in 3D space. So I'll right-click the bridge and choose Create Motion Tween. I'll lock every other layer by Option or Alt-clicking the dot under the lock icon on the bridge layer. And then I'll go to the last frame, and using the 3D rotation tool, I'll rotate the bridge on the Y-axis. And then using the 3D translation tool, I'll move the bridge along the X-axis. So I can scrub the playhead to preview this animation. Let's see what it looks like in the Flash player. Command Return on the Mac or Control Enter on the PC. So using a motion tween, I can even animate 3D objects. When you're using a motion tween in Flash, you need to target Flash Player 10. Now, when you're working on a project, you may be required to publish to a Flash Player version earlier than version 10. Those versions don't support motion tweens, so what you can do is convert those motion tweens into frame-by-frame animations. Just make sure that before you make the conversion, you do all the edits that you're going to do to the motion tween. This is because once you convert a motion tween to a frame-by-frame animation, you can never convert it back to a motion tween. So let's say my scene here is done. I just need to publish to an earlier version of the Flash player. So the last step after finishing all my animations is to convert these motion tweens to frame-by-frame animations. To do that, I'm simply going to right-click in the timeline, Motion Tween Span, and then choose Convert to Frame-by-Frame Animation. I'll do this for each motion tween. And notice that Flash creates keyframes for each frame. Now if I want to, I can change my publishing profile to publish to an earlier version of the Flash player without any problems. The motion editor allows you to refine motion tween animations to add more realistic effects like easing. Throughout this chapter, you'll learn how to work with the motion editor to modify your motion tweens. The motion editor should be right next to the timeline at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see the motion editor, you can always go to Window, Motion Editor. To modify a tween in the motion editor, the first thing you need to do is actually select the tween. So I'll select my motion tween and then click the Motion Editor tab to open the motion editor. Usually when you're working in the motion editor, you'll need a little bit more space than I have on my screen. So I'm going to click and drag to expand the motion editor vertically. The motion editor shows the curves of your animation. Right now, it's a little bit hard to see my animation in the editor, so I'm going to modify my view at the bottom left of the motion editor. You can modify your view in 3 ways. The option on the left controls the graph size. So you can click and drag and expand the graphs for each property. Another way is to modify the expanded graph size. Let's say I'm just looking at the X property for my animation. When I click on the X property, the area expands. I can then click and drag the expanded graph size slider to change the size of the expanded graph. Finally, I can change the viewable frame slider to see more or less of my animation. I usually like to see all of my animation, but when I'm fine-tuning an animation and I want to make very subtle adjustments, I like to view less frames at a time so I can get in closer. So in the motion editor panel, I can see my animation. On the stage, if I click and drag the playhead in the motion editor, I can preview the animation of the sun. See it fading in and moving upward. In the motion editor, that's reflected by a graph. In the basic motion section of the motion editor, you can see the graph for X does not move up or down. It's a horizontal line. This indicates no change in the X property for this animation. The Y property, however, moves downward, so you see this diagonal arrow. Notice that there are anchor points at the right and left of the line. I can move these anchor points to modify the properties of my animation. I'm not going to do that right now. So the main thing I want you to take away from this movie is that the motion editor is a panel that allows you to refine a motion tween. Let's look at how to use the motion editor to modify a motion tween. So on the stage here I have a motion tween, which is kind of hard to see, so I'm going to modify my view by pressing Command or Control 2 on my computer to zoom out a little bit. That's the command for View, Magnification, Show Frame. That fits the stage in my viewable area. So watch the sun as I scrub the playhead. So the sun moves up and fades in. So we'll use the motion editor to modify the animation to move the sun up a little bit higher. So just note where it is right now. Remember to edit the tween in the motion editor, you need to select the tween in the timeline and then go over to the motion editor tab. If we're going to modify the vertical position of the sun, we should expand the Y property in the motion editor so we can get a better view. So now I have my expanded Y property. If you want to, you can click and drag the viewable frames option so you can get a larger perspective if you'd like. So let's modify the animation. At the beginning of the animation, you can move the playhead to the first frame and then click on that anchor point at the top left of the Y line. Once the anchor point's selected, you can see the Y position of the sun. That's 250 pixels. Remember that in Flash, the XY origin is at the top left, not at the bottom left like it is in math class. So a higher value means the object is further down. That's why you see a downward line for the Y position, because the value starts out higher and then goes lower as the sun moves upward. So let's go over to that last property keyframe and click on the end anchor point in the Y position line. Now we can see that the value is 147. One way to adjust this value is to just click and drag that property keyframe up. Notice as I drag, the sun moves up and down. Also notice that you can't just drag it up and down, but you can also drag it left and right. This will extend or shorten the animation. So I'll go back to where it was before, and I'm actually going to hold the Shift key so that it will constrain to that same frame. To make the sun move higher up, I'm going to pull the animation lower. That looks like a good stopping point, so I'll release my mouse button. Another way to adjust the animation is to click and drag the slider for the property. So if I want to adjust the Y position, I can just click and drag that slider. So I'll move the sun toward the top of the screen, and let's test the movie in the Flash player to see how it looks. Command Return on the Mac, Control Enter on the PC. And there's the animation. So using the motion editor, you have fine control over the motion tween because you can adjust property values individually. In the motion editor, you can actually add and remove property keyframes pretty easily. In this movie, we'll look at just how to do that. Let's say for our sun animation, we wanted the sun to move up diagonally and then move down diagonally. So the sun rises and then sets. Let's take a look at how to do that. I'll select my animation in the timeline, and then go to the motion editor panel. I'll expand the panel, and then I'm going to press my keyboard shortcut Command or Control 2 to zoom out. So the first thing I want to do is adjust the X property of my animation. So I'm going to move to the last frame of the animation by selecting the property keyframe in the motion editor, and then I'm going to click and drag the X slider to move the sun to the right. So now when I preview the animation, the sun moves diagonally. Then I'll make the sun hold for a little bit and then go back down to the right. To make it hold, I'll move the playhead a little bit to the right, and then I'll insert a property keyframe by clicking the Insert Property Keyframe button. That's the diamond in between the two arrows right before the frames start in the motion editor. So it could be an empty diamond. So when you click the button, Flash will actually create the property keyframe. So I'm going to click that button. And of course, if I click it again, then Flash will remove the property keyframe. So I'm adding a property keyframe, and then I'm going to go to the end of my animation, and then I'll adjust the X and Y properties. So I'll adjust the Y first, make the sun move down, and then I'll adjust the X property, make the sun move to the right. So you can see that motion path that's controlling the animation. Let's preview this animation in the Flash player. So the sun moves up, holds for a second, and then goes back down. Now let's say, just for fun, that you wanted to make the sun move in an arc shape. Think about how you would do that. You could keyframe the animation in the motion editor, or manually do it on the main timeline, but the easiest way would be to modify the motion path. And go to the Selection tool, lock every other layer, and then I'm going to zoom in on my motion path. Now I'll use the Selection tool to modify the motion path to go in an arc shape. And that creates a little bit more interesting animation. Let's test the movie again. So the sun goes up and then goes back down. So using the motion editor, you can add or remove property keyframes and modify your animations however you'd like. Easing is an animation term that means slowing down or speeding up an animation at a particular time. Because in the real world, movement isn't always perfectly spaced apart, like how we've done motion tweens at this point. So using easing, we can speed up or slow down animations and give more life to them. So let's take a look at the sun animation that I have here on the stage. So if I test the movie, you can see the sun in the Flash player moving up at a completely even pace. Let's say we wanted it to be slower at the beginning and faster at the end. One way to apply easing is through the Properties panel. To do that, select the tween in the timeline, and then go to the Ease section in the Properties panel. If you click and drag down, you'll get a negative value. That's called easing in. Easing in slows the animation at the beginning, and it goes faster at the end. Easing out is what you get when you have a positive value. That's a slower animation at the end, and faster at the beginning. For this, since the effect is really subtle, I want to max out the easing and just apply -100. So I'm applying easing in, and the animation has updated. Let's take a look at this in the Flash player to see the animation moving slow at the beginning and faster at the end. So notice the sun takes a few seconds to come up, and then it starts moving more quickly toward the end. Granted, this effect is very subtle, but you can tell that it's working by looking at the motion path. Notice the dots on the motion path. These represent the position of the sun. So not necessarily every time the sun is updated, but they represent the different positions that the sun will have when it animates. At the bottom, there are a lot more dots than you see at the top. This means the sun's position gets updated, but the sun moves very little when it gets updated. At the top, each update is spaced apart more, meaning the sun moves more each time. You can apply easing in the Properties panel by selecting a tween and then going to the Easing section. While it's possible to add easing in the Properties panel, the best way to apply easing to your animations is in the Motion Editor. In this movie, we'll look at how to do that. Let's take a look at the animation I have in the Flash player. I have an olive falling down from an olive tree. Looks like it's falling because it's a little bit too big. So if I preview the animation, it's 300 frames long, and then the olive just goes from the top of the tree to the bottom of the tree. Very robotic, no easing. So let's apply some easing through the Motion Editor. Select the tween, go over to the Motion Editor, and then scroll down to the very bottom in the Eases section. In the Eases section of the Motion Editor, you can add easing methods. The default easing method is Simple Slow. This is the same method that's used in the Properties panel, so for right now, we'll just ignore it. To add other easing methods, you can click the plus button to the right of Eases in the Motion Editor. Here are a whole bunch of preset easing settings. You can even create your own with the custom setting, which we'll talk about in another movie. The top half, from Simple Slow to Stop and Start Fastest, are really basic easing patterns. So if you want to experience those, you can select them and try them out on your own. The really interesting ones are the bottom half that are the custom easing animations. Let's take a look at Bounce In. Bounce In, as you'd expect, gives a bounce effect to an animation. I'm going to expand the Bounce In ease, and then I'm going to enlarge my expanded view using the slider at the bottom left of the Motion Editor. So as I scroll, I can preview the bounce animation. For easing, you'll see values from 0 to 100 on the left, and then the frames at the top. 0 represents the beginning of your animation, and 100 represents the end of the animation. In this case, 0 represents the olive at the top of the tree, and 100 represents the olive at the bottom of the tree. So when we look at this in the timeline, we can see how this curve works. It goes from 0, and then by frame 140, the animation gets all the way to frame 100. Then the animation goes back to about 65% at about frame 180. And then it goes back to 100%, which is the olive all the way on the ground, at frame 215. Then it bounces up a little bit more at frame 240, and then down to the ground again at frame 260. Another little bounce, and then finally it ends on the ground. Once you've set up your easing method in the Eases section of the Motion Editor, you can apply that easing to a property or group of properties. So I'm going to scroll up in the Motion Editor, and I'll go to the Basic Motion Properties. So in there's X, Y, and Rotation Z, which is basically just regular rotation. So if I want to apply that same easing to just the Y property, I can do that with the Y dropdown. I can choose Bounce In. I can also apply easing to all basic motion properties using the Selected Ease Basic Motion dropdown. For now, I'm just interested in the Y property, so I'll set it to be Bounce In. You can then see the green easing curves applied to the animation. If you expand the Y property, you can see how the easing curves are applied. So basically, the easing curves are going to override my default line, which is that black line. So the green curves are going to be the new way that this object animates. So let's test this in the Flash player to see what it looks like. So the olive will fall down from the tree. Granted, it's pretty slow, but we'll fix that later. And then it'll hit the ground, bounce up, then go down again, bounce lower, and smaller bounces each time until it comes to an end. You can customize your easing in the eases section of the motion editor by modifying the slider that shows the strength of the ease. So I can click and drag bounce in to the right. If I expand bounce in, you'll see that a little bit more clearly. So I can apply the ease over a shorter period of time or a longer period of time, or reverse it with negative values. I'm going to click and drag this all the way up to 100 to apply this easing over the shortest amount of frames possible. So you'll see the animation's just about done at 140 frames. So that will speed up the animation just a little bit. Let's test this again in the Flash player. So the olive falls a little bit faster, bounces up, bounces a few times, and then stays at the bottom till the end of the animation. So remember, the best way to apply easing is through the motion editor. While you can apply preset easing patterns in the motion editor, if you really want perfect control over the easing in your animations, the best thing to do is to create the easing patterns yourself. In this movie, we'll look at how to add custom easing to an animation through the motion editor. So I'm going to select my olive animation, hop on over to the motion editor. In the motion editor, I'll expand my view and scroll down, and I'm going to add a custom ease. Now I'll click on the custom ease to expand it, and then I'm going to expand my frame viewing area to cover the whole span of frames for my animation. Just make the motion editor a little bit bigger, and now I'm ready to create. The default easing curve is a straight line, so it goes from 0 to 100. I can actually click on any one of those points, and I get Bezier curves that I can modify. What I want to do for this animation is pretty similar to the bounce effect that's already built into Flash. But I want to create a bounce effect that happens a little bit more quickly, and the olive doesn't bounce as high. So I want a really short, brief bounce for an olive, since an olive doesn't bounce in the same way that a ball would bounce. So what I'm going to need to do is add anchor points to my easing. So I'll go to frame 60, and then I'm going to click the Add or Remove Keyframe button in my custom ease. So I'll put an easing keyframe there. Now I'll click and drag this all the way up to 100. Remember that you can hold the Shift key to make sure that you keep that on the same frame. I can move my Bezier handles however I want. If I have an S curve, then the animation will start off kind of slowly, it will hit the ground slowly, and that will create more of a realistic animation. So I'm going to leave it like that, and then I'm going to add the bounce. So I'm going to move in one of the handles. Remember that you can hold the Option or Alt key to just move one handle at a time. So I'll create a little bit of a bounce. Notice that the lowest point in my bounce is about 85%. You can control this to be however you'd like, but this is what I want for my animation. And I'll add another keyframe, about frame 150. Click and drag that in, adjust the Bezier curve, and then I'll add one more bounce. So I'll go to frame 190, add one more keyframe for the easing, keep it at the bottom, adjust the Bezier curves one handle at a time, a little bit lower than the first one, and then I'm going to use the handles for the end of the animation to make them straight so that the olive stops moving after the second bounce. Once this is set up, I'm going to apply the easing to the Y property. So I'll scroll up, find the Y property in the basic motion section, click the easing dropdown, apply the custom ease. You can see the green curves for my animation, and then I'll test this in the Flash player. So watch the olive fall down, and looking at the animation, seeing it go slow at the end, and the bounces as slow as they are, don't really look right. So let's make some adjustments to our custom easing. Scroll down, and then I'm going to click the first keyframe in my easing where the animation is at 100%. I'm going to adjust the Bezier handle, and then I'm going to move the keyframe over a little bit so the animation will happen over a shorter span. I'll also adjust the bouncing. Let's see how that looks in the Flash player. The olive falls, bounces, and stops. Now, if you really wanted to perfect this animation, you could work on it more and fine-tune it as much as you'd like. Just know that when you want to apply custom easing, you can come over and do it in the motion editor, and then you can control how your easing works by adding keyframes and adjusting the Bezier curves. Let's say you created an animation and it's just happening a little bit too slowly or too quickly, and you want to extend or shorten the animation. Let's take a look at what I have in the Flash player. So the olive falls down and bounces on the ground. But let's say I wanted to make this animation a little bit faster. I want it to fall more quickly. Motion tweens allow you to do that very easily. All you have to do is go to the end of the motion tween. So I have my last frame here, and then hover your mouse over the end of the frame span. Notice your cursor updates to show an arrow on the left and the right. From there, you can simply click and drag to adjust the duration of your animation. Now this is going to expand or contract your animation, including easing effects. So I can set this anywhere I want. Let's say I go to frame 200, and I'll test the movie and see that it's a little bit faster. Now let's say I wanted to extend the timeline past frame 200. Because right now, if you look at the animation, the olive will disappear once the animation's done, and the rest of the artwork will remain on the stage. So let's say we want the olive to stay on. Now, the intuitive thing would be maybe to add more frames to the olive layer. But if you do that, then Flash will think you're trying to extend the motion tween, and the easing will get thrown off. So the best thing to do is to select the olive on the stage. So I'll have to unlock the olive layer in my file, copy the olive, create a new layer, create a blank keyframe on the frame after the last frame of your animation, and then paste the artwork in place. So now I have a seamless transition from the animated layer to the static layer. Now if I test the movie, you won't see the olive disappear. So just remember, you can extend and shorten a motion tween by clicking and dragging at the end of the frame span. With the Motion Presets panel, you can apply pre-made animations to objects on the stage, or you can save and reuse your own animations. In this movie, we'll take a look at the Motion Presets panel and how you can use it to be more efficient when you're working in Flash. So on the stage, I have an animation of an olive moving down. Olive bounces when it hits the ground. So let's say I wanted to make that animation apply to another olive. So I have an olive at the right side of the screen here. To save the animation as a motion preset, right-click your animation in the timeline and then choose Save as Motion Preset. Now we can give this a name. I could call it olive drop, or I can give it something more generic that might be more useful for another object later on. So I'll just call this simple bounce. So I'll click OK. And then I'm going to open the Motion Presets panel. If you don't see the Motion Presets panel, you can find it by going to Window, Motion Presets. In the Motion Presets panel, you'll see Default Presets and Custom Presets. Let's expand the Default Presets folder. If you click on the different presets in there, you can preview animations. So you can take these animations and apply them to different objects on the stage. For this example, I'm just going to use the animation that we already saved. But you can apply these pre-made animations in the exact same way. So I'm going to close the Default Presets folder, and then I'm going to select the olive on the stage, open the Motion Presets panel again, and then I'm going to click the Simple Bounce preset that we created, and then click Apply. That's it. Flash now applied that animation to the olive on the stage. So I'll test the movie and see what that looks like in the Flash player. So you can see both olives falling down. So with the Motion Presets panel, you can save and reuse animations. Sometimes when you create an animation, you may want to reverse it. In this movie, we'll look at how to do that. I'm going to test my application in the Flash player, show you what it looks like. Notice that everything is moving to the right except for the hills in the front, which are moving to the left. So this looks a little bit awkward, and I'm going to fix it by reversing the frames. So to reverse the animation, all I have to do is right-click my tween in the timeline, and then scroll down in the menu that pops up and choose Reverse Keyframes. Animation is then reversed. I can test the movie in the Flash player and see that the problem is solved. So if you ever want to reverse an animation, just right-click the animation and choose Reverse Keyframes. One of the neat effects that you can create in Flash is the effect of a camera moving or zooming in and out. In this movie, we'll take a look at how to do that. The first step is to take your animation and nest it inside of a symbol. So I'm going to select all my frames below the border layer. To do that, I'll deselect all my frames and then click on frame 1 of the logo layer and drag all the way down and to the end of my animation to select all the rest of my frames. Now I'll cut these frames by right-clicking and choosing Cut Frames. Now I'll delete every layer except for the border and the logo layer. I'll change the logo layer's name to Animation. Now let's insert a new blank symbol to paste the animation. Insert New Symbol. I'll name this Animation and then paste the animation by right-clicking the first frame of layer 1 inside of the animation symbol and then choosing Paste Frames. So there's my animation. I'll go to Scene 1, or the main timeline, and then scroll to the first frame. Now I'll unlock the animation layer and click and drag the animation symbol from the library on the stage to create an instance. I'll move this into place, and then what I'll do is scale up the symbol. So I'm going to zoom out, and I'll move the transformation point right over the girl on the bike. That way, everything scales around her, and that's what I want to do. So I'm going to drag it using the Free Transform tool, and then I'll move this whole instance to the right using my keyboard. So let's preview this animation in the Flash player. So the girl rides in on the bike, and it's close up. Once she gets all the way in the frame, we'll zoom out. So let's create that animation. Right-click any frame in the animation layer and choose Create Motion Tween. Then we're going to insert a keyframe at frame 60. So I'll right-click there, and then choose Insert Keyframe All. Then I'll go to the last frame of the animation and scale the whole thing up. In order to do that, I'll need to zoom out. I'm using the keyboard shortcut Command-. That's Control- on the PC. So we're going to zoom out by scaling down. The fastest way to do it is to use the Transform panel and to set the scale width and scale height manually. Remember, you can find the Transform panel at Window Transform. So I'll set the width and height to 100% for each. And then at the last frame, I'm just going to use my keyboard and mouse to move the instance in place. I'll zoom in. And what I'm really looking to do is get that logo at the bottom left corner. That looks good. Now let's test the movie in the Flash player and see what it looks like. So the girl rides in on the bike, close up, then the whole scene zooms out. Now, of course, if you wanted to, you can add more frames and have the animation hold, or do whatever you'd like. The main thing I want you to take away from this movie is that by nesting animations inside of symbols, you can create camera, zooming, and panning effects.